All right, good morning. Happy Friday, and welcome to PT on Ice, your daily show. This is brought to you by the Institute of Clinical Excellence, and I will be your host today. My name is Megan Peach. I am one of the lead faculty for our Rehab of the Injured Runner courses, both live and online. So, today I want to talk to you about the first metatarsal phalangeal or MTP joint. And specifically, I want to talk about how much range of motion do we actually need for running activity? And I'm talking about endurance running, not sprinting. But how much range of motion do we actually need in this joint? So, let's start by talking about what happens in that joint when we are actually during that stance phase of running. By the end of the next few minutes, I want you to have a really good idea of how much range of motion maximum do you need for an injured runner to get back on the ground running. During the first 0 to about 20% of stance, we don't need that much range of motion in the joint. We start at about 30 degrees of extension in the joint. And that's because while we are in swing phase, just before we hit the ground, we're working to clear the ground. And so the MTP joint is extended, the ankle joint is dorsiflexed. And we do that so that the toes don't hit the ground. Worst case scenario in a runner is that the toes hit the ground and we fall or we trip, cause a different type of injury. And so we extend that first MTP, we extend that ankle joint, and we clear the ground. As a result, that MTP joint remains extended about 30 degrees as we touch the ground. And so during that first initial loading phase, about 0 to 20%, what happens is that we plantar flex, relatively speaking. So if we start out at 30 degrees, we go from 30 to about 10 degrees or a neutral position in that first MTP joint. So it's relative plantar flexion, although in the end we remained extended. So what happens in the next 20 to about 50% of stance phase, so all the way up to mid stance, is nothing. It's really not that exciting in that MTP joint. And that's because that joint, that foot is secure on the ground. That joint isn't going anywhere. It remains in a neutral position. It's just there to accommodate our weight bearing on the ground and take on load from the ground. That's it. So, really, from that 20% to about 50% of stance phase, it remains in that neutral position. Now, what happens from 50% on is where it gets a little bit more exciting as far as MTP joint range of motion goes. So, from 50 to 90%, this is where we see the biggest jump in range of motion in that first MTP joint. We go from a neutral or about a 10-degree uh, extended position all the way up to about 60 degrees, 50 to 60 degrees on average. But there's a caveat here. This most of the studies are in rear foot runners. And so in rear foot runners, we do see this 50 to 60 degree extension by the time we're at 90% of our stance phase of running gait. In midfoot, forefoot strikers, we actually need a little bit more. It's not much, maybe 10 degrees or so. So they may see 60 to 70 degrees of first MTP extension as they approach 90% of that stance phase. So they do require just a little bit more if that runner is going to be a midfoot or a forefoot striker. Again, only talking about endurance runners and recreational runners at that, not talking about sprinters or any other type of track and field athletes. So once we hit about 90% of our stance phase, then we've hit our maximum need for extension range of motion in that MTP joint. Once we're at about 60 degrees, that's our maximum need that is required for running mechanics, but also push off mechanics as well. And then what happens from that 90% all the way to 100% is when we finally get a toe off from the ground. So, up until this point, that MTP range of motion, the extension range of motion, has been entirely passive. So, from 50 to 90% of stance phase, that first phalanx or the great toe has really remained in a neutral position as far as just the great toe goes. And that MTP joint has rotated around that first phalanx because the heel has lifted up off of the ground and the heel has started its push off or propulsion phase after that 50% of mid stance. So the foot and ankle are rotating passively, or sorry, the MTP joint is rotating passively around that phalanx. In order to actively extend that MTP joint, we would require certain musculature to actively extend it that are not active at this point. And so it's all passive rotation. But at 90% to 100%, we then start to get active range of motion within that MTP joint. And what happens is that we need to get that final stage of toe off from the ground to propel ourselves forward. And in that final stage, we start to recruit muscles like the flexor hallucis longus. That flexor hallucis longus engages and then actually plantar flexes that MTP joint. So we go from 60 degrees extended all the way back down to about 30 degrees of extension. So again, it's a relative plantar flexion, but in the end, once we actually push off, we are still in about 30 degrees of extension. And so this is because it's now an active plantar flexion of that MTP joint. So this is great. Now we have a number that we need in terms of a maximum amount of extension in that MTP joint. But really the big question is, why is that so important? And so we have to go back and look at the foot mechanics and the mechanics of that MTP joint and what is it really doing for the foot and ankle and the soft tissues around that joint. And there's three major things that MTP extension is going to help in terms of biomechanics to propel the body forward. So the first thing that happens with MTP extension is that we get this strain starting in that plantar fascia. As that MTP extends, we get increased tension in the plantar fascia, except the plantar fascia doesn't have a lot of elasticity. And so what happens is that as that plantar fascia begins to take on strain, begins to take on load, we don't have anywhere to go with the plantar fascia. And so what happens is a very familiar thing. We call it the windlass mechanism. But the medial longitudinal arch starts to elevate from away from that plantar fascia or away from the surface of the ground or the shoe in this case. And so when that medial longitudinal arch elevates, we're actually creating this locking mechanism within that arch, within the bones of that arch, and it creates a stable surface for that runner to then propel themselves forward. Without that stable surface or that rigid structure to jump off of, it's really, really difficult to really create any propulsion forward. And so that extension from the MTP joint really helps to elevate that medial longitudinal arch, create that windlass maneuver, and then create that rigid structure to propel it forward. The other thing that happens with the increased strain in that plantar fascia as a result of the extension in the MTP joint is that that strain within that soft tissue actually translates all the way up to that Achilles tendon. So if you go back to anatomy and remember that the Achilles tendon has fascial attachments from that tendon surrounding that tendon through the calcaneal attachment and all the way down to that plantar fascia. And so what happens when that plantar fascia takes on strain or takes on load, then we actually get strain within that Achilles tendon as well. It's passive strain within passive tissues, but it's still strain, it's still tension that's accumulating within those tissues. And what happens when we accumulate tension in passive tissues is that the active tissues attached to those passive tissues don't have to do as much work. And so think of it as if the plantar flexors attached to the Achilles tendon first have to induce some kind of load or strain or tension within that Achilles tendon, then that's a lot of work for them to do versus if that tendon already has tension within it, then it's much better able to transfer load from that muscle to the bone without that muscle having to create that tension first. And so it's sort of like a primer for that tendon when we get tension created from that MTP extension to the plantar fascia and then to the Achilles, it may all be passive, but it's still tension that that muscle does not then have to create. And so that's the second way that we can that MTP extension helps to aid in propulsion forward. If the Achilles tendon, or sorry, the plantar flexors do not have to create tension in the Achilles tendon, they can then just do their job by creating force and then propelling that body over that rigid structure. Okay, so the third function of that MTP extension also has to do with the length tension relationship in the muscle tendon units, and specifically the flexor hallucis longus. And so, if you go way back to anatomy and remember your anatomy of that flexor hallucis longus, we know that it inserts on that first phalanx of the great toe, and it inserts proximally, which means that it has to cross that first MTP joint first and before it inserts into the bone. After it crosses that first MTP joint, it can then insert into the phalanx. And so we know that when a tendon crosses a joint, that that joint is going to have a pretty profound um, result on what happens with that tendon and the length tension relationship in that tendon, depending on the range of motion within that joint. And so, if we extend that first MTP joint, then it's going to create tension in that flexor hallucis muscle or tendon, sorry, and so that flexor hallucis muscle no longer has to create that tension first before just producing force. It is going to be able to transfer that force because the tendon already has tension within it. Again, so if we didn't have this mechanism there and we didn't have tension within that tendon, then the muscle would have to do that job first before it was able to actually transfer force from that muscle to the bone. We need that force transfer because that flexor hallucis is part of a secondary plantar flexor, and it's part of the final push off process from that 90 to 100% during running. And so it's a really, really important mechanism. Okay, so really to sum things up here, we need 60 degrees of MTP extension during running activity. And it's a really, really important range of motion because anything lower than really about 40 degrees does not induce those mechanisms for creating a rigid arch to push off of or creating a situation where those muscles can act optimally to produce force so that we can propel ourselves forward. In other circumstances, they have to first create tension within the passive tissues. And so with this mechanism, they don't have to create as much tension. They can just focus on creating that force, and we can then propel ourselves forward. So, but that only happens beyond about 40 degrees of extension, and really ideally at around 60 degrees of extension during that terminal stance phase. Okay, so that's the content that I have for you today. Oh, what I forgot here was that if a runner does not have adequate MTP extension range of motion, and that happens, we could have hallux rigidus, we could have a joint fusion. We could have a number of circumstances that really prevent that first MTP from extending, and no amount of mobilization or mobility exercises are really going to get them there. It's important that we don't just ignore this and just say, okay, just go run anyways, because what is likely to happen is that if we don't get that adequate extension in that first MTP joint, what is likely to happen is that runner is going to then offload that joint onto the lateral column or the lateral aspect of the foot, because either weight bearing on that joint is uncomfortable, it's painful, or maybe it's so rigid that it's not uncomfortable, but they just don't have the range of motion to be able to propel forward. And propulsion forward really requires loading on that first ray. So the first phalanx and the first MTP along with that part of the medial longitudinal arch. And if we don't load there and we load over on the lateral column, it can be really detrimental to not only the soft tissues, but the bony tissues as well. So increasing risk for fifth met stress fractures, increasing soft tissue overuse injuries like Perineal tendinopathies, things like that, that would happen more from loading that lateral column. That first ray is much more robust than anything we have laterally, and so it takes on that load and that propulsion force much better than anything we have laterally. And so, if they can't get there in terms of range of motion in that first MTP joint, they're likely to offload it. We can help prevent this, maybe not entirely, but occasionally we might recommend a rocker bottom shoe for these individuals. And typically, a change of shoe recommendation is not our first go to. It's like our last resort when treating injured runners. Um, and in this case as well, it's typically a last resort. We try all of the mobilization, mobility stuff first before deciding that they might need a change in footwear. And so, a rocker bottom shoe can actually take some of the load off of that first MTP joint, especially if they're limited in range of motion, and it can help with that propulsion forward without requiring the same amount of range of motion as in traditional footwear or barefoot. Um, so there are interventions that we can use if they can't necessarily get that range of motion, but they still want to continue running. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a really good idea of not only the necessary ranges of motion that a runner needs in that first MTP joint, but the mechanisms as to why they might need that, as well as an intervention if they can't quite get there. Okay, so okay, I promise now that's the content I have for you for today. I don't think I forgot anything else, but I do want to remind you of a couple of courses we have coming up because Rehab of the Injured Runner and really the endurance team has a fantastic year ahead. And so our let's see, our Rehab of the Injured Runner online cohort has started already and it is full. But if you haven't gotten into that, if you didn't get into that cohort and you want to get into the online course for Rehab of the Injured Runner, sign up for our March course. It will come up fast. Go sign up now for really kind of specialized special groups in running content, as well as a big focus on gait analysis. So we always have a great time in our online course, and then our live courses are stacked this year. So personally, I am so excited to get back to the live courses. I've been on a 2-year hiatus from our live courses, and I'm stoked to be back. And so we've got a lot for you coming up in 2025. So let's see, Rachel's teaching in Colorado in early February. I'm in Tacoma in late February. Rachel again is in Grass Valley, California in March. Jason's in Bismarck in May. And then Rachel and I are in let's see, Bend, Oregon, and Boise, Idaho in June. And that is just the first half of the year. So stay tuned for the last half of our course locations. If those locations don't work for you, we have lots more in the last half in a lot of different locations. And so we are so excited to see you there. All right, have a great day.